Welcome back to this final episode of the series that we've been in on the parables of Jesus. If you hadn't had the opportunity to visit the other Bible studies, I do encourage you to do so. And if this is your first week engaging, I also encourage you to go back to the original and first introduction to the parables. As a reminder, parables in the scriptures are meant to be story metaphors. And a metaphor is when we compare one thing, a known thing, with something that is unknown in order to make it more known. So a parable or a metaphor is to help us understand in some ways deeper truth. And so there's always a shock factor in a parable, and we've been looking for that shock factor each week. And the same is true for today's parable, which is found in Luke chapter 18. It's a parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. As a reminder, we've been looking at this book, or using this book as a resource, The Kingdom Equation by John Timmer. So let us read today from Luke chapter 18, starting with verse 9. He also told them this parable, that's Jesus, to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, when we typically read this parable, actually when we typically read a lot of parables, we want to associate them in a moral sense. Most of us, when we read this parable, automatically put ourselves in the status of the tax collector. The man in this parable that is begging for mercy and beating his breast. He must be the one that we should emulate because he's the one justified before God. And that means we put the Pharisee down here. He is the one that we don't want to emulate. And thank God I am not a Pharisee. But the reality is that most of us stand in between, somewhere in between this tax collector and this Pharisee. We are a combination of both. Even though when we read the parables, we often want to associate ourselves with the good guy in the parable, that is not what this parable is really about. So how would the original readers have heard this parable? Well, contemporaries of this parable saw this parable as quite a shock because they assumed when they were hearing it that the Pharisee would be the one that would have been justified before God, even in the way that this parable is written. So by the end of the parable, when the tax collector is the one that's justified, it does not meet their expectation. Now, normally when we talk about this parable, we assume this Pharisee and this tax collector come to the temple on their own individually to pray, and they just kind of meet up with one another. But that is likely not as what is happening in this text. In fact, this is likely a place of communal worship where everyone in the community has gathered together in order to be in worship with one another. And so we see that maybe after the service of sacrifice or the service of atonement, these two men go up to the altar or whatever at the same time, right after the service has ended. And this temple that is a place of communal worship is mentioned. So the tax collector stands, it seems, at a distance, likely not just from the Pharisee, but also from the community at large. The tax collector's prayer, though, in this passage is a prayer of atonement, which likely means that it was at a worship service that was either at 9 a.m. or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, because those were the services of atonement. The Pharisee, though, is praying a different type of prayer. I want us to look at it real quick, because he says, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Lord, I thank you. I thank you that you have worked in me enough that I am not like these thieves and these rogues and these adulterers or even like this tax collector. And then he goes on to pray in his prayer what he does. He fasts twice a week. He gives a tenth of all of his income. We realize in reading this that the Pharisee is actually a good man. Even though we have painted him pretty poorly through this parable, he's actually a good man. He's doing everything that he has been asked to do. He's an upright citizen. And it is not a bad thing that he is thanking God that he is in and has become the good man that he is. This would have been a common Jewish prayer at this time. But how does God, that's the question, see this Pharisee? He no longer is able to really see what the Pharisee is doing or who the Pharisee has become, because the Pharisee is so filled with pride that he can't see past himself. C.S. Lewis once had a quote from his book Mere Christianity that says this: "Pride in and of itself is essentially competitive. It's competitive by its very nature. Someone isn't prideful just in and of themselves. While the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man." So we say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than others. If everyone became equally rich or clever or good looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is the comparison that makes you proud. It's the pleasure of being above the rest. And that's this problem with the Pharisee, because these parables, which are essentially all about the kingdom of God, says that there is not space or room or a place for pride in the kingdom of God. Not in the pride, how we understand it, of being comparing yourself to other people. And so what the Pharisee didn't do is he was really speaking a prayer that was actually a prayer given by the psalmist. And he obviously had studied and memorized lots of the Torah and probably the Psalms as well. And he was praying a prayer from Psalm 26. The problem is at the end of Psalm 26, which you're welcome to read on your own, I'm just going to read the last sentence. He left out a very important part of the prayer. He said in verse 11, 26, "But as for me, I walk in my integrity, but redeem me and be gracious to me." The psalmist understood his life as needing redemption. The Pharisee did not. And that's the difference between the Pharisee and the tax collector. The tax collector is not to be commended in this story. He's still a tax collector. He's still doing things that are outside of God's will. But the thing is, he knows it. He's aware of it. And the most important thing that he does is he asks God for mercy and redemption. And so we are all a mixture of both tax collectors and Pharisees at different times and at different moments in our lives. But who we are matters less than who God is, because to God, we are all just someone in need of his mercy. So as you unpack today in this final Bible study, as you have conversation around that idea, how do you think God views you?
We are going to pick up where Pastor Karla left off, of asking, what is our mental picture of God? Now, God has been portrayed in a variety of ways throughout history. Let's take a look through that artwork today. So here are a variety of ways that God has been portrayed over the years. From Michelangelo's depiction of God and Adam to also his depiction of the Last Judgment, to a more contemporary interpretation of being held in God's hands by Erickson. Or we see God as the Father, or God, the opposite, and this angry God. So what do you feel or see or notice about God's character in these paintings? Which of these images do you relate to most? Or even just at this moment or season of your life? And what does that say about your relationship with God? Now we can see through the variety of ways that God is represented in these pieces of art that we all have different experiences of God. Sometimes that perception can be shaped by our own life experiences, and in turn this shapes how we think that God views us. We know that just like the Pharisee and tax collector, we have the capability to be both of these characters, yet God's love for us never changes. Although we may have skewed perceptions of God or only understand parts of the relationship, God never changes. The beauty of creation and the unique purpose that God has put on each of our lives is that we do all have unique relationships with God that are both beautiful and challenging and even hard to articulate at times. So through this study, we tried to give examples of how we can deepen our understanding of God through the art of parables and visual arts. And we hope that this has awakened your faith journey and broadened how you see and experience your Creator.